All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. If it's your first time here, great to have you. My name is Drew. I'm an exercise physiologist and a Chinese medicine practitioner. And this channel is all about learning functional anatomy because when you understand how the body works biomechanically, as in what the muscles and joints are meant to do normally, and then you can apply that into your therapy, your exercise prescription, with a lot more knowledge and confidence and autonomy. And that really kind of helps you know if you're doing the right thing or what order, what sequence, and what's appropriate to do. So definitely understanding the body will help you, whether you're a massage therapist, a personal trainer, an exercise physiologist, an acupuncturist, because even though we all have unique differences, essentially we have more similarities and differences in terms of our anatomy. And today we're looking at the hip flexors, particularly these two muscles here, the psoas and the iliacus, which is also referred to as the illiopsoas muscles. And essentially, it's kind of considered to be one muscle, mainly because they share a big ass tendon down here that goes under the femur. So we're going to break them down into two muscles first, and then we're going to look at what they do together, particularly. So let's have a look at our psoas. So this is a really, really big, powerful, strong, thick muscle. And a lot of therapists spend a lot of time working with this muscle. If we can get this one very functional, it's not only amazing for your back, for your lumbar spine, it's amazing for your pelvis and for your hip joint, and also for your breathing and your diaphragm. Okay, it has lots of things going on with this muscle. So I spend a lot of time helping people create a really strong functional psoas. And there's a bit of misunderstanding out there as well about what it does and what it's capable of doing. So as always, when we break down the anatomy, it helps explain what's happening. So let's have a look at it. So the first thing we want to look at is the origin. So origin is where the muscle's attached to on proximally in the skeletal structure. And so the proximal origin here is the vertebrae. So we have L1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first thing you appreciate is that this big ass muscle here, the psoas, attaches onto the vertebral bodies, okay, of the 5 levels of the lumbar vertebrae, so your lower back, and also onto the lumbar vertebral discs here, which aren't shown. So this muscle is one of the few muscles that actually structurally attaches to the vertebral body, so the big bones of the spine, and also onto the discs themselves. So anything that affects this muscle will 100% absolutely affect your lower back and the discs. Okay. And particularly for that reason, anytime you have a lower back problem, often this muscle is associated with it. It's either creating a problem or it's trying to protect you or compensate. And so we need to help kind of restore its function to get the back moving really well. Now, if you look on the back of here, it also attaches to what's called the transverse process. So this is your vertebrae here, and these kind of bones that stick out to the side, these are the transverse processes. So each level of your lumbar vertebrae, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. We also have attachments to these side bones here. And we also have attachments to T12, the thoracic vertebrae 12, just a little bit at the bottom of that one, but it does attach. The other thing to kind of consider here is that the fascia that wraps around the psoas then attaches onto the fascia that connects to the diaphragm above it. So anything that affects the psoas muscle will affect the diaphragm, which will affect your breathing and your upper back posture particularly. So your diaphragm, psoas have a strong link together functionally. And then as we travel down, the psoas then kind of hooks around this bone here. This is the pubic ramus here, the pubic bone. Okay. Okay, it goes underneath the inguinal ligament. So there's a nice space between the inguinal ligament and the pubic bone, so to allow all these muscles to come through. And then it's going to wrap around to what's called the lesser trochanter on the femur. So the lesser trochanter is this big knobbly bit on the back of the femur. Very hard to kind of palpate because you've got the hamstrings, the adductors, and the quads all surrounding this area. You can get access to it if you get the leg in the right angle, but typically it's very hard to palpate. But this psoas muscle attaches directly onto the less trochanter. And whenever you have a big bony sticky out like that, or a protrusion, usually the bigger it is, usually means the bigger the muscle attaching to it. So like the tibial tuberosity here, big bony growth here where you have strong muscle attachment, similar here. And you can see the size of this tendon is really big. All right, it's probably bigger than the Achilles tendon. And the muscle itself is very, very powerful, particularly when you put in kind of combination with its little brother, the iliacus, which we'll get to in a moment. So in terms of attachments, we have all 5 lumbar vertebrae. We have T12. Then we go down on the inside of the pelvis, okay, across the pimicramus, onto the femur, onto the lesser trochanter. Now, if we come behind the nerves that innervate or connect to the psoas, if you look at innervation of quick facts, insertion, innervation, anterior rami of the first, second, and third lumbar nerves. So what that means is it's the front part of the nerves that are coming out of the first, second, and what did it say there? Third. Yeah, so the top 3. 1, 2, 3. So these nerves here, if I can click on it, the purple ones here are going to attach onto the psoas. So that's the nerve supply to the psoas, but then that becomes the lumbar plexus, which lives within the psoas muscle itself. And so the lumbar plexus is all the nerves that kind of come out of these lower back areas, regions, and then they go into all the lower limbs, into the pelvis. And depending on which level the nerves are being affected, depending on which muscle might be affected. All right. So if you get a issue with the psoas, all right, you're going to get compression or irritation or restriction or an inhibition of the nerves that are coming out at various levels. And so that might affect just the local level. All right. So if you get like here, for example, a L3, L4 disc herniation, which compression of the nerve root, then the segment of the muscle that gets innervated by that nerve root will be interfered with, but you're still going to get nice innervation from the nerves above and below it, which is pretty cool. The problem is because it's connected to the lumbar plexus, then it can kind of also then travel down and to the muscles that it feed into. So, for example, at L3, L4 typically goes into your quads on the front. So you might have quad weakness from a lower back muscle injury, or for a disc injury or something's going on, or even if that muscle just gets really tight and starts to kind of spasm and lock up, you can get some issues with that, which is not cool. So if we want to keep this muscle really, really happy as much as possible. Now, if we look down at our little friend here, the iliacus, which is our second big hip flexor. So it's a really big flat muscle, which basically attaches on the whole surface of the ilium here, but on the inside, on the anterior surface. So all around through here. Okay. Hooks around underneath the inguinal ligament coming across here from your ASIS to your pubic ramus here, your pubic symphysis. So that's the inguinal ligament there. And then basically joins that psoas tendon, and it becomes one tendon, similar to the way that the Achilles tendon is joined by the soleus and the gastrocnemius. So we have the same kind of thing here. So it becomes one big, thick, chunky, strong tendon. So essentially, it's very difficult to isolate these two muscles because, like in the calves, they share the common tendon. The difference is that the iliacus only really affects the pelvis, whereas the psoas affects the lumbar vertebrae as well. But if you're trying to recruit the iliacus. It's very difficult to recruit the iliacus without recruiting the psoas, if not impossible. So they're essentially considered to be one muscle. What we will do in manual therapy and in various exercise prescription is we try to strengthen both muscles and also provide mobility and stretching to create proper length. So then we can then layer in our exercise prescription correctly. Good massage therapists know how to get into here, and we have a whole range of trigger points along this region of the iliacus. And on the front here, we have trigger points in the psoas as well. So often a good massage therapist or manual therapist will be able to kind of manually release these muscles because it's just super tight, which often happens with any lower back injury. Okay. Initially, it's tight to guard and protect and to stop you re-injuring the structure in the tissue. Also, because it's so powerful, it'll stabilize the spine to stop it from moving, which is good. You want that early on. But then once the kind of initial injury is healed, okay, if we don't then remind the muscle to relax and to release and to kind of restore back to its resting length, you can maintain this tightness in both the psoas and the iliacus, and that can change the pelvis position and the lumbar spine position, and that can create a lot of kind of postural and biomechanical issues down the track where it's not resolved correctly. So often a lot of lower back problems are created from initial injury, which then resolves, but then the kind of guarding pattern that was there to protect and stabilize doesn't resolve, and you're left with a change in the shape and orientation of the spine and the pelvis, which has implications up and down the kinetic chain. So that's the two primary muscles. Also, we need to kind of acknowledge that the other hip flexors, we have this rectus femoris here, and we also have our big hip flexors coming off the pelvis here. So things like our adductor brevis, adductor magnus longus, things like that, which are all hip flexors because they attach onto or have attachments to the pelvis through this region through here. So when you're doing hip flexion work, you can kind of work through the lumbar pelvis hip flexors or through the femoral hip flexors as well. So something just to keep in mind there. So it's quite a complex region. So let's have a look at some of the movements to kind of just describe what's happening with the psoas. So we go into our motion, and as always, we're using Complete Anatomy app. I'm just scratching the surface of this app of what you can kind of learn from it. So there'll be a link in the comments below. So definitely click on that and get your own version of Complete Anatomy. It's just an amazing tool to learn from. So if we go up into motion here, and the primary thing that people get confused off is like when the psoas muscle is used in core training. Now, unfortunately, for some reason, the Complete Anatomy crew have laid all the abdominals in front of the psoas and I can't get rid of them, so I can fade them all, which is okay, but I want to really show you the hip flexors here, the psoas. So the primary thing that the psoas does is creates hip flexion. So that means, hip flexion and spinal flexion. So let's have a look here at spine flexion. So that's where you're folding forward or curling forward. So if I was to flip this around, it would be, imagine you're lying on your back, you're doing a sit up here. Okay, so this is your sit up movement. So the muscles here in orange and yellow, they're pulling on the vertebrae. They're literally pulling on the vertebrae because they're physically attaching on the vertebrae. And they are curling your trunk forward, they're flexing your trunk. Okay. Now, this typically happens when your pelvis is anchored. So think when you are doing sit-ups and someone's holding onto your feet, or you've got your feet anchored under a barbell or a firm surface. So when the femur and the pelvis is anchored, all right, so there's no movement through the lower limb, you will tend to kind of create a curl. And this happens in conjunction with the abdominal wall. So if I put the abs back in here, so this is all your abdominal wall here. This is the external obliques kicking in. So all the abs are working to create this sit-up movement, and we'll do another video on the abdominal wall particularly. So we have transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis, internal external oblique. When they work as a unit together, they create spinal flexion or the sit-up movement, and they also work with the psoas muscle here particularly. So what happens is we're told that you can't do sit-ups past 30 degrees because once you go past 30 degrees, essentially what happens is the abdominal muscles here. So if we go, that's essentially 30 degrees of flexion. Okay. The abdominal muscles are fully contracted. They can't go any further. And so if you like do a sit-up where you bring your chest to your bent knees, for example, then that's all going to be hip flexors pulling you on there, which basically is what happens. And that's said to be bad because it's structurally pulling on your vertebrae, on your lumbar vertebrae, which is said to be bad. So in movement, there's not really any good or bad. It's just isn't appropriate for the person's function and capacity at the time. So if someone's really, really well trained and they know how to do sit-ups correctly and how to activate the core, their abdominal wall, then this is a totally normal functional movement. I mean, how do you get up off the floor without doing some kind of curl crunch? You can't. So you have to use it. So there's a reason why it's there. In my opinion, where people go wrong is they overemphasize doing too many sit-ups, too many crunches, too many hip flexion-based core training, and they don't train all the back extensors, which we'll do another video. So you want balance, you want that agonist-antagonist relationship. Because any time that you're training and you're turning on or activating the abdominal wall, so as the abdominal wall, you're neurologically inhibiting or relaxing the back extensors, and they'll lengthen and stretch. So sit-ups are a good way to actually stretch your lower back. But if you don't strengthen the lower back, then you'll create an imbalance and a muscular weakness, and you'll put more stress and tension through the soft tissue structures, and that can lead to overuse and potentially kind of like injury because the forces are excessive through certain segments and certain joints, which is what we want to avoid. We always want to try to train a balanced functional core. So that's that's spinal flexion. So that's moving, basically you're folding the 5 lumbar vertebrae about 5 degrees each, and together that adds up to about 30 degrees of movement in the spine. Then, because we have a left and a right psoas, we also then get lateral flexion, which is side bending. Okay. So here, the psoas is going to pull down, and so you're going to lean out to your side, and that's lateral flexion. This happens in conjunction with your spinal extensors, which we'll do a video on soon, and also your external obliques and internal obliques, and also your quadratus lumborum muscle. So if you're not doing some version of lateral flexion for your core training or your lumbar rehab, lower back rehab, you are missing out on so much work because this is a very, very functional movement. The spine's designed to side bend to the side to laterally flex. It also is a brilliant way of stretching and lengthening the opposite side eccentrically. So you're contracting this side concentrically, this side lengthens eccentrically. And then depending on the position you do it in. So this person's like standing up. So if they laterally flex this way to the left, all right, then gravity's going to pull down this way. So you're going to start getting gravity work on this side. So the movement becomes more, the stretching side is getting strengthened versus the side just leaning to, because basically the muscles don't need to do a lot of work to side bend against gravity through here. But if you were to do this in a side plank position where you have to lift up into this shape, all right, then it's this part of the muscle here, the one that's contracting, bringing the ribs towards the hips, which will be doing most of the work. So position changes how muscles work a lot. Okay, so side planks are perhaps one of the best exercises to build into your core training repertoire or program, okay, at an appropriate progression, because you can develop really strong quadratus lumborum, internal external obliques, back extensors, and also train the psoas muscle at the same time. So 4 really, really big, powerful muscles that we want to get really, really well trained at. People who have weak psoas have weak carrying capacity. So if you enjoy and involved in a job where you've got to carry loads, so think like a suitcase, for example, single arm carry. All right. When you do a single arm carry, what's happening here is all those four muscles I'm talking about are stabilizing you to stop you from tipping over. So you get this kind of like nice functional isometric stabilization of the spine in a very practical, functional way. So your loaded carries, your farmer carries are actually really, really good ways of developing these muscles in core strength, if you know what they are. Okay, and the third movement is hip. No, we want trunk. Where's trunk flexion? Here we go, hip flexion. So hip flexion is where we flex the hip or we lift the knee towards the chest in this type of movement. Okay. So this one you need to visualize. Now, this is where core stability is really important. So for you to lift the weight of your leg up, so each leg roughly weighs, let's say, 25% of your body weight. Okay. So 20 kilos of weight just in your leg to lift your weight up. If you're 100 kilos, what's roughly? Okay. So your hip flexors are going to be actually flexing here to move the femur up to lift your leg. And if your core is weak, what will happen that you'll lift the knee up, but also then your lumbar spine will either, depending on the orientation position, it'll either flex or it'll extend your spine. So it'll either arch your lower back or it will curl you forward, depending on orientation and pelvic position. Okay. So for example, in this position, right, if this is pelvic neutral, all right, so we're not anterior tilted, we're not posterior tilted, we're pelvic neutral. The psoas muscle is fairly vertical, so you're going to get a vertical pull. Okay. And the hip is essentially lining up almost perfectly with the attachment of the transverse processes, right? So the forces will be fairly neutral. So the abdominal wall and the posterior wall will be able to stabilize and keep your spine fairly stable and still. So you can use energy to drive and lift the knee up, which is cool, which is what you want. Now, if you have a bit more of an anterior tilt, okay, for whatever reason, and if this psoas muscle gets really tight, what it tends to do is that it flexes the spine here and puts it into extension. So it kind of makes you do a little arch, because if this orientation goes anteriorly forward, all right, the line of pull changes and then you start getting more of a lumbar extension or a back bend. So it kind of reverses its coil. Even though I said before that you can do flexion, which is where the spine goes the other way, all right, depending on the orientation of your pelvis, it can also create a really, really tight lower back, okay, and then feed into an anterior tilt. So that can be really bad. And particularly if you've got a weak abdominal core, that can then create this issue where the spine essentially just goes in extension and you get this kind of really strong hip flexion because the muscles are really strong and tight. And just where the orientation of the femur is in the hip joint in relation to the center line of the muscles pulling, that can create that kind of lumbar extension and a bit more of an anterior tilt. Now that can be really good because that can be quite a strong position too. So there's always a little bit of a what if, or it depends. So if you're a sagittal plane athlete, so a forward and back athlete, you want a really, really strong kind of lumbar position. But if your sport activity requires a lot of rotation, side bending, twisting, if that's too strong, you're going to create a lot of resistance and tension and stiffness in the spine. And then the movement's got to give from somewhere. So it'll either come from the lower back, through the hip, through the knee, through the ankle, or even up the kinetic chain. So as always, we want a muscle that can lengthen through its full range of movement with enough strength to control all the forces at the end range, and then also return to its resting length. So we want to go both ways. So the goal is to have long and strong muscles which are flexible enough to take the joints through their full range of movement with control. That's the goal. When you can retrain your muscles, particularly these ones, the hip flexors, to do that, then a lot of people's back pain will go away. Because a lot of issues in people's lumbar spine and pelvis is just that these muscles are not balanced correctly. They're not either firing in the right sequence, the pelvis isn't orientated in the right sequence when they're executing the movement, and they're not coordinating with the abdominal wall or the core and the diaphragm to place this everything in the right position so the muscle contract, ideally lengthen, and then relax and come back to resting position. So a lot of it is like very much technique orientated. If the muscles are hypertonic because they've been spasmed, they've been in guard, or they've been inhibited for whatever reason, manual therapy can be really appropriate to kind of basically remind the muscle to relax and restore back to its resting position. This is why manual therapy will always be necessary. Manual therapy being massage, physio, chiropractic, osteo, acupuncture. We're really all those manual therapies are doing is restoring tissue quality and reminding the nervous system about, yeah, okay, safe, you can contract, relax now. And they just have all these various techniques to help the body do that. And then we need to then retrain all the muscles, okay? Because if the muscle's not strong enough, if this psoas muscle is so weak that it can't resist gravity enough, generate enough force to resist the gravity that it can't lift this 20 kilos worth of leg off the ground, it won't do it. It just won't be able to do it, and it'll get inhibited. So if we can't restore the physical strength of the muscle to actually resist the forces to move the limb, all right, it's just simple physics, then the muscle won't work and will become what we call inhibited. Okay. And I had a client yesterday who is post-stroke. 1 year post-stroke, unfortunately, had not had any rehab for a year because lived in a very remote community, and was able to kind of finally come in to get some therapy. And her stroke, this particular client, affected her right side, and she couldn't activate her hip flexors at all, so she couldn't lift her knee up. So there's no muscular activation going on there, which is more of a brain level issue versus a local level. But she could activate her quad muscles. So she could extend the knee, but she couldn't flex the hip. And if you can't flex the hip, that means you can't lift your leg. And so try walking without lifting your foot off the ground. Very, very difficult to do. All right. So that's an example of innervation. So if that muscle's not working, the psoas muscle's not working, then you can't lift your knee. So then walking is very, very difficult. Okay. All right. I worked with people with chronic lower back pain where they've been in pain for so long chronically that this hip flexor muscle group goes from being incredibly strong and spasm, and then after a while, the mechanics of the pelvis change, and they basically start to atrophy and get very weak, and they lose that strength, and then they can't do their job, and then they get in a really nasty pain situation because basically the muscles just aren't doing anything. And the body is resting on the skeletal structure and on the joints, and that just stresses out the joints and fatigues them and activates a lot of like pain sensitization, and that just is quite messy. So the way to get out of chronic pain, particularly if there's no anatomical reason why the pain's there, as in like there's a nasty disc prolapse and it's compressing a nerve root, if all that stuff's resolved and there's still chronic pain, in my experience, it's a biomechanical technique, posture, exercise progression issue. Just haven't had the right exercise in the right sequence, the right therapy to slowly retrain the muscle to gain strength. Because muscles take time to develop strength. You've got to layer in the right sequence, in the right order, in the right progression. So going from the most simplest basic assisted movements, even going into water, and then slowly getting up to where you're doing like full double leg levers and things like that, like gymnastics, strength training kind of stuff. So there's a progression, which is why we have exercise therapy professionals like myself, exercise physiologists, who guide people through that process. So that's hip flexion. Now, the other thing that we might see is because of the attachment of the psoas and the iliacus, to the greater trochanter, okay, if you visualize this muscle pulling in that way, so you're going to get a rotation of the femur there as well. Now, this will change depending on the position of the pelvis here. Okay, so in this neutral position, if it's fairly neutral, all right, what you'd expect to see would be the hip going into external rotation, all right, which is good. So that means that the femur is going to get rotated that way. All right, so as it's pulling up this way, and it's going to turn the foot out or turn the knee in. So it looks like the kneecap will turn into the middle. All right, but that's actually rolling the leg into external rotation, like that way. What happens if you get into an anterior tilt position, it'll reverse and then you'll get medial rotation. So you'll get those knock-kneed pelvis type of legs. And then that kind of feeds into a pattern where you get tight hip flexors, tight adductors, internal rotation of the femur, anterior pelvic tilt, and everything gets really tight and strong on the inner side. And then all your external rotators like your glutes, glute medius, glute max, things like that, they're in a weaker position, so they're not as strong, and you don't get a functional stability and hip extension going through, which is a problem. So depending on the orientation of your pelvis, you're going to get some rotation of the femur in both directions as you're moving through anterior to posterior tilt, which is quite normal. Okay. Okay, so we'll go back. So you can kind of see it a bit easier there. So if this muscle is pulling up there, it's going to rotate the femur that way. So the kneecap will go out. So it'll externally rotate out, which is okay. So things like when you're doing a squat, when you set your feet up in the triangle of your feet, okay, and then you set your neutral pelvic position up, okay, and then you just externally rotate the kneecap to then line up with the middle toe, all right, then you'll have this nice stance aligned position, okay, which is pretty cool. So we're trying to get these joints to be in their nice alignment so that then they can roll in their sockets or glide across their surfaces smoothly without any excessive or uneven loading. Okay. So for example, if you are too internally rotated in the knee, then the knee, you're getting more surface contact than the other surface, and then theoretically that can walk or grind down that surface a little bit. But once you get this bad boy strong and this bad boy strong, okay, you get a really strong lower back. Your breathing becomes inhibited. I mean, it no longer gets inhibited by tight psoas. Your lumbar pelvic mechanics work really well. And then when you integrate that in with your kind of anterior core, you'll get good pelvic control, particularly on the front. And then when you develop your posterior chain, so your glutes, lumbar extensors, and back extensors, when you develop those, you start to get a spine that works really, really well. Okay. And that's the goal. When I do back rehab people, my goal is to basically retrain the spinal column. So all the moves on the spinal column. Okay. And essentially, when we are retraining psoas, we're training spinal flexion, lateral flexion, and hip flexion. Even though hip flexion is not directly related to the spine, you're using muscles that attach onto the spine, so it's a stabilization mechanism. So then you get lumbar or spinal stabilization or neutral bracing. So you get 4 movements when you're training the psoas. It's one of the reasons why it's really, really important to train. Okay. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions around psoas, iliacus, lumbar stabilization, all that business, please leave a comment in the section below, and always happy to answer where I can. In the next video, we're going to keep building on. I'm going to work our way up the torso, and so we'll go to the back, and we'll be looking at the lumbar extensors, particularly all these spinal extensors, and we'll see you then. Okay, thanks for watching. Please feel free to like, share, and leave a comment. We'll see you in the next video.